Okay, in this video, we'll focus on how we can really make the most of group work. So we'll talk a little bit about the research, and then we're going to talk about strategies that we can use in the classroom. Let's begin by just taking a moment to think about why is group work so important? Well, employers really want these skills. They ask for students, graduates rather, that have teamwork ability, communication skills, and those are skills that are probably best learned in group activities. We notice that there are definite advantages of students participating in group work. This meta-analysis of 37 different studies showed that students who participated in group work had higher level of achievements, persisted on tasks even longer, and had more positive attitudes. So we know there's a lot of research out there that speaks to the power of working in groups, although it can be a challenge to set up. So what we're going to do is talk about how we can do that. Well, it makes a lot of sense that we would learn best in groups. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory focuses on how we can't really talk about cognitive growth and development without talking about our social cultural components of who we are. So it's really essential that we engage with others. We do this, throughout our lives. We learn when we're working with other people. It's sort of the reason why we have class. If we didn't have any need for class, we could just give really independent study situations out and say, here, go read all of this, go come back and show me that you learned it. But that's not the only goal of working to. First of all, you're going to learn the content better. And second of all, you are also going to develop those skills that employers want. Now, we all know there are a lot of problems with group work. It doesn't always go well, and I'm sure you've had your fair share of bad experiences. So what we're going to do is talk about some ways that we can try to minimize those. There's nothing perfect here. The chances are you will continue to run into some issues, but by following these strategies and tips, it should minimize it to some extent. Well, the secret to group work really is that when you ask students to work together, there should be a reason that you're asking them to do that. So if it's a small assignment, not everything needs to be a group assignment. So you want to make sure there's a reason for that interdependence, that need for other group members. In addition, we want to make sure we're holding students accountable so that we don't have that one student who carries the whole group, does all the work, but really allows for everybody to participate. As with all kinds of teaching methods and approaches, we definitely want to make sure that we're choosing a teaching method that works well with the goals that we have determined for our class. So this is back to that learning outcome conversation. Once again, you're going to hear it all semester long. Learning outcomes, learning outcomes. They drive the rest of the course design process. So sometimes people talk about brainstorming that happens in groups, and I just wanted to share with you this study that actually when you get folks together to brainstorm, it doesn't always lead to the best outcome. Sometimes people may not share ideas because they're worried their idea isn't as good as someone else's. There may not be time for everybody to get involved. So there's a different process called the nominal process, and basically what that does is it says work independently before you start working together. So it's kind of building in some think time, and they're asking people to all put it on paper. So you're documenting what your contribution to the group conversation will be before you actually engage in the discussion. And what these researchers found is that that usually leads to better quality and even more creative ideas. There's another twist on that called brain writing, and I really like this process, and it works well in groups. So here's how it works. You basically get a group, say of 4 or 5 students together, and you ask them to, whatever prompt it is that you want to ask. I think the example they use in the article is creative uses of a paperclip. So everyone would then write down on an index card one creative use of a paperclip, or whatever your prompt is. Then what you do is you take your card and you pass it to the right. So you're kind of 4 or 5 people sitting in a circle, and the card gets passed to the right. Now you have a card in front of you that has one idea on it. So you have to write another idea. And it can't be the idea you already wrote on a card previously, and it can't be an idea that you already read on a card previously. So what happens is that those cards get moved around, usually around a full circle, and then at that point, all of the ideas are discussed. what these researchers have found is when you use this approach, you end up getting many more creative ideas, because when you have that index card in front of you, you start to think, oh, maybe this will be a good idea as well. So it kind of serves as a trigger and an idea generator. Now, one of the trickiest situations really when you're talking about groups is, how do you form them? Do you let students choose their own groups? Do you decide? How does that work? Well, really, the research kind of points to assigning groups. And here's why. If you let students choose their own group, they tend to find other students who are very much like them. And that doesn't necessarily promote critical thinking. We're more likely to engage in critical thinking when we're in a group with people who are different from us and have different perspectives. In addition, one of the biggest concerns I have really is that if you let students self-select, oftentimes low ability students and students of minority status may be negatively impacted by that self-selection process. You know, the high performing students, they're probably going to be okay. You know, high ability, hooking up with other high ability students, they might be fine. But when you're thinking about your class as a whole, that's kind of problematic. So I usually suggest assigning groups. As I said before, you want to optimize that creativity. When you have people with different perspectives and ideas, it's much more likely for that to happen. So by having diverse groups and by encouraging people to be in groups with others who are different from them, much more likely to have creativity and critical thinking going on. Now, groups can get kind of comfortable in nature, so it is sometimes a good idea to switch groups after a while, so you don't have to keep the same groups all semester long. You may want to, give students an opportunity to be in a new group, and that can be particularly helpful if perhaps things aren't going so well in a group. It kind of gives a fresh start, but also when things are going really well, they might be going really well, but not everyone's quite contributing as much, and you kind of take for granted, that the leaders of the group are going to kind of carry you a little bit further. So I always think it's a good idea to switch them up after a while. So let's talk about some strategies we can use to try to equalize the workload, to make sure that there's not one student doing all the work or one student who's not doing any of the work. Well, first of all, you can engage students in training and talking to them about how they can establish some rules for the group and some roles for the group, depending on what the nature of the project is. I like to use what I call the 5R approach. And basically what that means is if you show this to students, the first thing they want to do is establish rapport. And that's an important part of the process, is to spend a little time getting to know your group members. After you do that, then you want to develop the rules. So if things are going to be due on a certain day, what is our expectation that people are going to be at meetings, are going to be participating in an online forum, whatever it might be, and what is expected of every member. Next, you might want to establish roles. So who might be the person that becomes the facilitator of the conversation? There might be someone else who's going to be the submitter of the assignment. You want to make sure everyone's clear about who's doing what. It's not really a divide and conquer kind of situation, though, that you should all go off on your own and do, like, I'm going to do this small piece of it, because in order for it to be effective, you need that interdependence and working together. After you've done that, then you want to get ready to work. It's time to roll up your sleeves and make sure you're ready to roll and get the work done. And then you need to remember to evaluate. Too often, students and really lots of folks working in groups forget to that pause, reflect time. So it's really essential that you want to build that into the process as well. Here are some examples of group roles that might work for a presentation, but again, you want to decide what they are. I do like the group role of questioner, and in most situations that can be a powerful role because students often don't want to challenge another student. It's uncomfortable, but if their role is to challenge the other student, it feels a little bit easier to do. And we want to try to avoid what's called groupthink. Groupthink is when one person says, oh, I have this idea, and everybody jumps on and says, oh, that's fabulous. And maybe it was fabulous, but maybe there was another more fabulous idea out there. So you want to make sure that someone's asking the question, okay, so it sounds like we think this is a great idea. What might be some other great ideas? Or what could be a potential problem with this great idea? What might make it not so great? Let's think about it. So by having someone in the group that asks those kinds of questions, it really can be quite powerful. So there's a lot of research that shows that if you train students, they end up engaging better in the process. So I often give a lot of in-class time when I'm teaching, especially the undergraduate level, because students, we can't just make the assumption that they know how to function effectively in a group. So we need to provide them with the 5R approach. We might want to have them do some of the group work in class so we can be there monitoring and intervening as needed. Here's a couple of research-based tips. First of all, if you ask students to work on something individually before they work on a group project, everyone's got something to bring to the table then. And that really, kind of increases that individual accountability so that it can't just be one person going to find all the research. If everybody has to do, say, a mini research paper before they get together with their group, that's a really powerful way to make groups more productive. The other piece is that you want to make sure groups are ready to be in the group activity. So you want to make sure they have that strong foundational knowledge. Did you teach them everything they needed? Did you give them the resources that they needed? Are they set and comfortable and ready? Or are you giving them a task that they don't really have the background knowledge to be able to conquer? So you want to make sure you're setting the stage to help students meet with success. Now, this is really interesting. So Barbara Millis is kind of a guru in the cooperative learning arena for group work, and I was at a conference with her once, and I was just kind of in awe of what she said. I said, so how do you, I feel like when students do a group presentation, there's one person that's carrying the weight a little bit more than others, and how do you deal with that? And she says, oh, that's simple. I randomly assign them the part of the presentation on the day they present. And I was like, what? Are you kidding? I'm like, is that really what you do? So it does make students quite nervous about it, but here's how I try to package it to them. I tell them that the way that this works is you have an individual presentation, but you're going to get a support team working with you. On the day of your presentation, you're going to get relieved of having to do some of the presentation part. The reason that this works so well is because if you don't know which part of the presentation you're doing, like slide A or B or C, you need to know all the content confidently so that you could present it. And that means you're going to depend on one another, and you're all being held individually accountable for learning that content. So as long as you're prepared to do the entire presentation, it shouldn't be a problem that you're randomly assigned to one piece of it instead of the entire presentation. So I have found that students do get quite nervous about it, but when you explain to them the rationale and you provide a lot of support to make sure that they're in a good place by the time they're ready to present, it can go really well. And I tell them, anxiety usually is temporary and learning lasts forever. So, you're going to get over the anxiety, and the process that you went under is really going to lead to high level of learning. So it's pretty good trade-off, I think. And there's some research out there that if you tell individuals that you're going to be held accountable, that actually leads to better performance. So you don't want to surprise them at the end of the day. Oh, guess what? I'm going to randomly assign you to your presentation. No, you want to make sure they know this up front. It helps guide the entire group process. So the other issue related to group work is grades, and that's probably one of the more complex areas of, the process is how do you grade groups? Well, of course there are some issues, and I'm sure these are not new, or you're probably well aware of these issues already. High achieving students often drop in grade, and low achieving students often benefit from groups. So what you end up getting is this kind of, average grade that may not accurately capture the individual's work. That can be problematic. Looking from the student perspective, adult students or older students were much more dissatisfied with a group grade. They don't like that. They want their individual grade related to their work, while inexperienced group members thought everybody should just get the same grade. So, lots of different ways to go about it. Well, I know a lot of folks also worry about introverts. What happens to them in the group process, but this research study actually shows that although the extroverts like the group work better, the introverts did just fine. So they really performed equally well. So it wasn't a negative impact on their grade. Now, if you ask students to grade themselves or others, they tend to give themselves high grades and also their peers high grades. So it's a little bit of grade inflation. And I'm actually not a big fan of having students grade one another. I am a big fan of students giving feedback to one another, especially when there's some structure around the way the feedback is provided. But grades are tough for us as faculty to give, and I think it puts students in a really awkward, uncomfortable position to have to grade. They're not the expert, and they shouldn't have to make that judgment call of a grade. So what are some ways that you might be able to use feedback and to get more information on what's going on? Well, some faculty like to use something called a group accountability log. So basically it's a list of all the tasks, and they're tracking what kinds of activities are doing and who's doing it. So you can kind of get a picture of who's doing what, and they feel like you know what's going on. Another way of doing it is to give them some kind of online shared space so that you can see and go in and make sure that everyone is contributing. And if there is somebody who's kind of like not doing much or someone who's really carrying the weight, you can adjust the grade accordingly. Another great way to help with group projects is to link assignments. So as I said before, having a paper before having a group presentation is a really powerful thing. So in one of my undergraduate classes, the way I like to do this is I have students do a rough draft independently, get feedback on it, then an individual paper independently, get feedback on it. Now they shift over to the group arena. And in the group, they're all doing the same topic that they had their paper on. And now they're creating slides and the visual presentation. Everyone has to do that independently, but then they work together to create the best PowerPoint. So they look over here and say, oh, I really like the way you package that. This is a really clear visual image of the key finding of this study, whatever it might be. So it's a great way for them to do the individual work, but then also have the benefit of that support team. And then they would present together at the end of the semester. So a couple of other grading considerations. It's important for you to know not everything we do has to be graded. So, group work is good for students. It helps them develop skills, and we don't have to grade every single group activity. So that's important. I do think it's pretty important that we avoid firing members. Now, I know some folks say, well, that's how it is in real life. If someone's not pulling their weight, they get fired. Well, not really. They might get fired by their boss, but in a group, you're not their boss, you're their colleague. And we don't usually get to fire our colleagues. I know some of us might have colleagues we might want to fire. I think we all have had those kinds of experiences at some point in our life, but we don't get to do that. We have to find a way to work with them. So if it gets really to a point where it's not functional, we would then bring it to our boss, and students should bring it to the professor if it gets to that point. But I know that there's a lot of faculty out there saying, well, I give them the power to fire. And I don't think, again, that's an appropriate power for a student to have. So it's important for you to recognize that group grades can also have a negative interpersonal impact. So a student can start to have negative feelings towards someone if they felt like their contribution pulled their grade down. So you want to be very cautious about this. I'm a big believer in even group projects having an individual component. So I like to look at the level of effort that the student put forward, what were their contributions, what kind of value did they add to the project, in addition to the final product, of course. Because I just think that, just a group grade by itself is probably not effective or accurate. All right, so that's it for groups. We will be talking about some specific types of groups in just a little while, but I think that gets us started. I hope that those tips are helpful to you.